If you know someone in your life that's gone through a near-death experience, you might have heard them talking about their life flashing before their eyes, meeting angels, or having visions of the past and future. Such moments have a profound impact on the people that experience them, and it can lead people to rethink their entire way of living once they come back to their senses. A similar moment occurs in chapter 72 of Berserk, which had the potential of changing the entire trajectory of the story had it taken hold. Those of you who are familiar with the manga and have read the title of this video know exactly what we're talking about. It's the mini dream that Griffith has of being married to Casca. In this video, we're going to give you guys a full breakdown of their relationship before the eclipse and address the biggest what-if scenario from Berserk, in our opinion. What if Griffith and Casca actually got married? Do I hear wedding bells? One-sided emotion and complete control. Griffith and Casca's complex history. Love has been a part of their relationship since it began, but for almost the entirety of their association, it's been one-sided. Casca explained how she first met Griffith in chapter 16, and you can tell from her expressions, even in those flashbacks, that she loved him from the time she met him. When she was about to be assaulted by a nobleman, it was the White Falcon who appeared from out of nowhere, sliced off his ear, chastised him for thinking he owned everything because he was a noble, and gave Casca a sword to dispense her own justice. To her, Griffith was like an angel sent from heaven. No, he was more than that, because instead of merely protecting her, he gave her the means to fight back. The sword and blanket Griffith gave Casca that day earned him loyalty for life, and it was also the catalyst for Casca's feelings for him, no matter how much she might have denied it. As the Band of the Falcon grew, Casca became Griffith's number 2 in everything. She was his right hand on the field and off of it. With regular training and the need to prove herself equal to her comrades, she had become the Falcon's best warrior barring Griffith, and more often than not, she was the one keeping the boys in line. With that also came a glimpse into his true ambitions, and the realization that she wanted to stay by his side to see him turn it into reality. When Griffith signed up the band to serve under Genin, Casca saw two sides of him that she had never seen before. The first was his somber side. While taking stock of their losses following a battle, Griffith and his core crew came across the body of a boy. He was 10 years old, and he had joined the Falcons enthralled by Griffith's ambitions and by Griffith himself. He wanted to become a knight, but now his dream would never come true. The White Falcon wondered to himself whether that was his fault or not, and Casca took it to mean that he felt guilty for the boy's death. This was disproven by the second side of him that she witnessed, and it's this one that sort of blinded her to his true nature even further. Had he just been working under Genin's authority, Casca could have turned a blind eye to its moral implications. The governor had a sordid taste for young men, whom he would keep in his castle as cupbearers and attendants. Seeing the lifeless eyes of those kids reminded Casca of when she herself had nearly become like them, but Griffith's hand on her shoulder eased her mind. What threw it into chaos was seeing Genin's hand on Griffith's shoulder one night as she was making her rounds through the castle. Casca understood the implication of that silent exchange well enough. She was aware of Genin's sexuality, and anyone with two eyes could see how pretty Griffith was. She spent the entire night restless trying to come up with a justification that didn't involve Griffith sleeping with Genin because, number 1, she couldn't bear to see him in that light, and number 2, she was in love with Griffith. When Casca saw Griffith the next morning, he was bathing in a stream, and she wanted to run away at first. When he spotted her and asked her to join him, she couldn't find the words to say what she wanted to say, but Griffith knew. He asked her if she thought he was dirty, and Casca immediately rejected it, but also inquired as to why he was in Genin's chambers that late. When he didn't say anything, she started giving excuses for him, saying it must have been a war council, and she was mistaken. But Griffith hit her with a splash of cold truth. He was 100% correct. When she asked him why he would do something like that, the Falcon answered that he needed the money, and then went on to explain his reasoning from a purely logical standpoint. Constructing a standing army from scratch without a huge amount of funds was next to impossible. They could fight and build slowly like most people do, but it would only lead to the wastage of precious time and lives, both of which Griffith could be putting to better use. He doesn't feel any remorse over his comrades' deaths, but he feels guilty for being the only unclean one. He thinks that if there's anything he can do to honor their souls, it's to win, so he'll keep winning till he achieves his dream. While he was doing this, he was also tearing his own flesh apart, which made Casca rush to him and hug him from behind, just to get him to stop. The White Falcon snapped out of his monologue after realizing he'd said way more than he intended to, and reassured Casca like he did the very first time they met, as though he'd switched off his emotions on command. That day, Casca understood that she wanted to be the sword with which Griffith achieved his dream. She wanted to become indispensable to him, so he never got rid of her, all the while never even thinking about addressing her own feelings. She was fine with that, so long as it meant Griffith turned to her first with his problems, and soon enough, the rest of the band picked up on her attachment to him as well. They would never never call out Casca's attraction to him overtly, but they all knew that she would drop on a sword without even questioning it if Griffith asked her to. They also didn't question her authority much because she could kick all of their asses, but that's not the point of this video. Casca's love for Griffith was so strong that she couldn't stomach Guts' entry into their lives. Since he came into the picture, Griffith started relying on Guts more than Casca, and that made her jealous to no end. She would always pick a fight with Guts or tell him to hurry up and die because she wanted her Falcon's attention all to herself. Casca never got the courage to verbalize her feelings for Griffith, but she always knew that for his dream to come true, he'd need to marry a princess. When Charlotte came into the picture, she maintained her composure on the outside, but on the inside, she was hurting way worse than any sword could ever wound her. She wanted to see the love of her life succeed and realize his dreams, and she wanted to help him as much as possible, but that included killing her own feelings. Still, at least hers were pure, no matter how blinded she was by the false dream of a life with her Falcon. Griffith's emotions towards Casca were far more complex. For starters, he didn't see his companions as friends. He saw them as soldiers, tools for a task, with that task being helping him become king. But it wasn't as though he was entirely unaware of how people perceived him, especially those close to him, which meant that he must have known about Casca's feelings pretty early on, but he chose to leave them unaddressed. A great leader knows when to speak and when to hold his tongue, and Griffith certainly can be that guy when he's thinking straight, but when he isn't, his ego seeps out, and it shows you a part of him that most can't even believe exists. That's exactly what happened during the conversation between him and Casca while they were serving under Genin. When the Falcons had their second encounter with Guts, Griffith mortally wounded the guy. As he was recovering, he ordered Casca to warm up Guts because it was a woman's duty. She followed his command without question because she didn't foresee Guts joining the band at the time. But the fact that Griffith made her do something like that on account of her sex should have troubled her more than annoyed her. When she realized Griffith's true intentions for the swordsman, she simply asked him to hurry up and die so she could once again become the sole person Griffith relied on. That never happened. Once Guts became a part of the Falcons, Casca was pretty much sidelined from Griffith's life. He became the man Griffith turned to in his hour of need, not Casca. She had always thought that she would be okay with just being his sword, but as the years went by, she realized that Griffith was no god and she was a woman herself. She was aware of the fact that Griffith would take any shortcut possible to fulfill his dream, and the easiest shortcut of his life would be seducing Princess Charlotte. Casca felt like she could handle it, but after Griffith got thrown in a cell for treason and Casca learns the reason behind it, she pretty much gives up on life. She manages to save the Falcons from an ambush and lead them away from danger for over a year, but she knows she's just clinging to the dying dream of a man she didn't even know was alive. The Midland campaign had made Casca realize many things. Chief among them was the fact that there was no longer any space near Griffith for her to be beside him. That's how her romance with Guts begins, because the swordsman gives her what she truly wants, reciprocal love. Griffith, for all his awareness, never saw Casca as a suitable partner. If he did, he'd have given her a heads up on the fact that he was about to fake his death to lure out his enemies, but he didn't. Like the rest of his Falcons, to him, Casca was a tool for a task. She was his most malleable tool, and for that he was grateful, because he could shape her however he wanted to. But that kind of thing only works for so long. And speaking of her malleability, perhaps that's the reason why he does what he does once he's rescued. The true face of the fallen Falcon. How Griffith took advantage of Casca's feelings. In the aftermath of his year-long torture, Griffith was spiraling and hard. He was already losing his grip on sanity, as evidenced by his ramblings in chapter 49. The fallen Falcon simply could not stomach the fact that he was in the grasp of someone that was supposed to be in his hands. He blamed Guts for his current predicament, but that man was also his sustenance. What pissed him off the most about his dynamic with Guts wasn't the ocean of feelings he evoked within him, but the fact that he now burned brighter than his own dream in his mind's eye. That, to Griffith, was unforgivable. And just as he was thinking about that, the God Hand paid him a visit. After a year of helplessness, Griffith couldn't help but be interested at being called a prince and a king by beings that seemed to be otherworldly, but he was in no shape to do anything they expected of him. His arm and leg tendons, as well as his tongue, had been ripped out by his torturer. He could no longer walk, hold a sword, or give commands, all of which are kind of necessary things when you want to be a king. He had been flayed and burned so many times that his exposed muscles had become his skin. If we had to sum up how he saw himself after being captured in one word, it would be powerless. Perhaps that's the reason that the Falcon disgraced himself with the woman he once saved from a terrible fate. Because one of his lead characters could no longer speak, Miura used his expressive eyes to convey his inner emotions. Griffith's eyes were expressionless at the sight of Princess Charlotte, the woman he wanted to marry, bawling her eyes out for him. She doesn't want to leave his side and is willing to give up her title just to be with him. When Bakiraka assassins ambush the Griffith rescue team, Charlotte takes a poison dart for him, and even though she's dying, all she wants to do is be by Griffith's side. side, but he tells her to go with Anna in chapter 57, despite knowing he'd be giving up his greatest political hostage because, on a personal level, he wants nothing to do with her. His eyes would remain normal in most cases, with the sole exception being when he looked at Guts and Casca. With the former, his two primary emotions were rage and jealousy. When Griffith sees Guts for the first time since his incarceration, his first move is to try to strangle the guy. It's only when he feels his tears that he relents, but Judo noticed that brief moment regardless. This must be why he asks Guts to leave and take Casca with him once the rescue is over, because he understands Griffith's true nature better than most. When the fallen Falcon sees Guts clear out the soldiers sent to capture them like a human whirlwind, he cannot believe just how much he had progressed as a fighter, and that reminds him of his own powerlessness, which gives way to his jealousy. That black flame burns stronger once he starts realizing that Guts has not only stolen his dream and his band, but he has also stolen Casca. In chapter 56, after emerging from the Tower of Rebirth and reaching the escape point, Guts and Casca share a moment that clearly tells you they're together. The 100-man Slayer was panting like a beast, leaning on his sword, covered in sweat and blood from head to toe. He had basically just replicated the effort that turned him into a legend, and he was pissed beyond belief. Usually, if anyone tried to approach him in that state, he would punch them away and tell them not to touch him at all. That would have been doubly true if the person was Casca, because before his imprisonment, what Griffith knew was that these two absolutely hated each other. But seeing her wipe the blood off his face and calm him down shocked Griffith, because he knew this could only mean one thing: Guts and Casca were now an item. The way Miura draws Griffith's eyes in this moment of realization is so visceral and sinister that it clearly tells you he's deeply offended by this development, not only because he never expected it, but because he believes Casca belongs to him. She had never treated anyone like she was treating Guts in chapter 56, except for Griffith, and this jealousy isn't born out of the kind of love Guts and Casca share. It stems from the fallen Falcon's inherent need to control those around him. Casca was pretty much a slave to his creed before Guts left the Falcons. Her dynamic with Guts had improved just before his departure, to the point she actually tried to get in the way of their duel, but ultimately she ended up staying with Griffith. Of course, he couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams that the events of the Wounds chapters would occur, but they did, and now he felt like he even lost the one thing he could reliably bend to his will at any given time. His feelings of jealousy and loss of control only got more and more intense as the escape progressed, especially when Wild showed up. The Black Dog Knight was clearly not a human based on everything the fallen Falcon witnessed out of his getaway carriage. He was keeping up with Guts like it was nothing, where most people wouldn't even be able to follow his movements. But when Wild assumed his release state, Griffith knew just how tough this fight was going to be, because he had fought Zod alongside Guts a lifetime ago. He wanted to be of use when the swordsman was engaging the monster, but when he couldn't lift up his sword, he resigned himself to spectatorship. This was probably a bad idea, because what he saw was Guts putting his life on the line to fight something they couldn't be together, and Casca rushing to his side to save him. At one point, the Raider captain gets knocked out by Wild's assault, and she slaps him back to consciousness, all the while crying and screaming about how he was going to take her with him. She must have been loud enough for Griffith to hear, because his eyes became china plates upon witnessing the whole scene. When Casca got picked up by Wild, Griffith, who was being carried away to safety, broke off from his escort and tried to go save her. This is one of the only times when we get to see some sort of positive affection flowing out of him for Casca. Before his torture, Griffith kept Casca at an arm's distance emotionally, but he never mistreated her, and he was always grateful for her support and concern. In chapter 33, when he comes back to life and lets his people know he's safe, he's taken aback by their delight at first. He can't seem to understand why they were so happy or why Casca was crying in his arms, but he softens and compliments her on her dress, acknowledging his people's worry for him, but never quite understanding it. Griffith wasn't the kind of person who wouldn't fight for you if he thought you were worth it, yet that too is a part of his controlling nature. He protects what he wants to preserve for himself. That is why he tried to stop Wild, knowing damn well he couldn't. Maybe things would have actually gotten better had Guts managed to kill Wild and not just put him to sleep. The pair shared a brotherly moment in the carriage together, and when Casca welcomed him back home, Griffith actually smiled. But then, Demon King Kong woke up and tried to save himself by using Griffith, and any hope of a positive conclusion to this rescue went up in smoke. Wild exposed the Falcon's many injuries to his soldiers and ridiculed them for hoping that things would get better on account of his return. He was right, of course, because the Falcons were hoping to re-establish themselves once Griffith returned. But now that they knew he would no longer be able to hold a sword or ride a horse, any hope of restarting the fight for his dream was dead. Griffith could sense it, even if he didn't hear his men's despair. Perhaps that's why what he actually takes away from the conversation are the words of Wild's actual killer, Zod. The Immortal One promises Griffith that his Behelit would return to him when he needed it the most, because that's how it worked. And in that moment, Griffith really needed the power to change his world, like that fortune teller had promised him he could if he just used his Behelit. Perhaps it was because he felt so weak, so small, so helpless that he pulled off the most disgusting act of his life as a human. He tried to assault Casca. In chapter 71, after most of the band had come to terms with their leader's condition, Casca goes to check up on him because she knows they can no longer abandon him. As she changes his bandages, she notices how small and fragile he truly was. She feels it's her duty to place her hand on his shoulder for reassurance like he did to her all those years ago, but just then, Griffith shows his true face. Instead of accepting Casca's platonic love, he acts on his desire for power by trying to assault her. This might not be clear to some readers, considering Miura only drew one panel implying it, but given that in that panel you can clearly see Griffith place his crotch over Casca's, the implication is pretty concrete. Casca is in total shock by this sudden turn of events. She's shivering to the point that she can't even respond the way she normally would. So instead she hugs him, because in that moment, that's what she thought he needed the most. However, once she leaves the carriage, her body betrays her suppressed thoughts and emotions. Casca sits outside the carriage in the fetal position, having a full-blown panic attack, which makes total sense considering she nearly got subjected to the same thing Griffith saved her from all those years ago by the very man who saved her. It must have shattered her entire idea of him as a person, but more than that, she felt extremely guilty because of her relationship with Guts. When he sees her in that state, she tries to deny that anything had happened, but she tears up anyways. Guts immediately senses that something major had gone down, but Casca screams at him that it wasn't like that. She worships Griffith so much, she isn't even willing to call his attempt to assault her what it actually was, and instead tries to drive Guts away. She reminds him of the conversation they overheard at Primrose Hall, and this was a big mistake, because she thought Griffith was sleeping, but he was wide awake. The Falcon realized why Guts and Casca were behaving the way they were properly for the first time, and he couldn't believe what he was hearing. We'd like to think that Griffith's last conscious thought was him trying to grasp how two things that were supposed to be in his palm now had so much control over him, because from here on out, he pretty much goes insane. Yet, it is within that insanity that we see a glimpse of a possible future that could have avoided all the suffering the world has been through from chapter 73 onwards. And it's that glimpse that forms the basis of this video. A glimpse of a serene future. How one split-second thought could have changed the landscape of Berserk. Before we go any further, we just want to say that we don't think Griffith was entirely incapable of doing good. We've seen him do things for his comrades most mercenary leaders wouldn't, and the fact that all his knighted captains were commoners shows you the people's champion mentality that was rooted within him. But he was utterly unaware of how emotional boundaries worked, and he had no limitations when it came to the pursuit of his dream. Had Guts and Casca been two people that were outside the scope of his dream, maybe the eclipse would have never affected them, but because they were such an integral part of it, he couldn't digest the fact that they wanted individuality when they were supposed to submit to him. That childish, grasping mentality is made all the more evident in chapter 72, when we learn that Griffith's self-image is still stuck at the age of 7, when he was running around the cobblestone streets of the city that birthed his dream. It's that inner child that motivates him to take control of the wagon and ride it to the site of the eclipse, which manifested in the form of a castle, because their dream wasn't over yet. And if they wanted to make it a reality, they needed to embrace what was coming next. It's a miracle that he was able to steer the wagon as far as he did with just his teeth, but eventually his invalid status was bound to catch up with him. The wagon ended up hitting a rock on its path, and this sent Griffith flying through the air. As he flew, Griffith witnessed what felt like a dream to him and an alternate future for Berserk to us. In this dream, Griffith is sitting on a chair as someone calls out his name twice. He isn't back to his old self like at the beginning of this chapter. He still possesses the scars from his imprisonment, and he seems to be on a wheelchair, which means this is well after his torture. That voice he heard was coming from Casca, who informed him that it was supper time. She threw open the windows of what looks like a countryside cottage. She catches him staring at her and asks him if there's something on her face, but all Griffith can think of was, where the hell am I? He couldn't tell whether this was a dream or reality, so when Casca asks him if he was daydreaming about the old days once again, he takes it to mean this vision is reality, and his real reality was a dream. She continues by saying she misses their friends, and wonders out loud whether he was still swinging his sword somewhere. It's clear that she's talking about Guts as Miura zooms in on a sword and a shield with the Band of the Falcon's emblem emblazoned on it. A coat of arms is only hung up like that once somebody's retired from their life of fighting, and if you couldn't couldn't tell already, that's exactly what this dream was showing Griffith, a scenario where he does give up on his dream. In this scenario, Griffith accepts his inabilities, retires as a mercenary, and marries Casca. In fact, they even have a child together, whom they've named Guts. Casca thinks that their wartime stories would make great fairy tales for their kid, and then tells herself that she's more suited to the married lifestyle with Griffith, their son Guts, and their dog Pippin. As she feeds him some soup, Griffith agrees that this peace and quiet was not so bad. But just then, he sees his behelit emerging from his spoon, and that brings him back to his flight. Upon landing, Griffith finds his behelit, but he also pretty much loses the final vestiges of his sanity, triggering the eclipse. We all know how the story plays out from there, but that brief glimpse of a future filled with peace tells you all you need to know about what would happen if Griffith and Casca had actually gotten married. We call that dream an alternate reality, not because we want to sound fancy, but because that's how this causality business works. Fate only has control over a man's life as long as they play into its hands. It was Griffith's fate to become the fifth God Hand member, but that dream represented a future where he resisted that fate, accepted his powerlessness, and actually submitted to his needs for love and support. It isn't as though this future is without its flavor of Griffith's trademark arrogance. He named his son with Casca Guts and his dog Pippin. Griffith pretty much thought of Guts as a brother and a son, among many other things, and Pippin was his most unquestioningly loyal soldier. Even in this alternate reality, he's putting his friends beneath him and Casca beside him only because he can't go on without her. Still, at least here he accepts his limitations and doesn't try to become a demon king to combat them. That is far better than him breaking the world and actually finishing what he started in chapter 71 with Casca, because in reality, nothing about their union was consensual. Griffith simply wanted to assert his newfound power as the God Hand Femto over both Guts and Casca, which he does in an incredibly disturbing fashion. And after the eclipse, you can forget about Griffith and Casca ever getting married to one another. In fact, it would be a miracle if the latter managed to keep her sanity around him, considering how severe her PTSD is. The only time frame where Griffith could have gotten married to Casca was after his escape, and that too was as a way to cope with the loss of his dream. As an invalid, he no longer had the need to marry a princess, so he chose the person that knew him best. The world would have been at peace had that marriage actually gone through, but alas, this is Berserk we're talking about. The moment Griffith saw the behelit emerging from the spoon, he chose his original dream over this tranquil new one, and the rest, as they say, is history. Marvelous verdict! We know this was a long video, but we hope you guys can see why, because this was a topic we had to speak a lot on. But enough out of us, what do you guys think? How would this possible future have played out? Is there any chance it could still happen? Who will the branded girl actually end up with? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.